What terrifying secret did your family hide from you until adulthood? I have a cousin whom I was always told had special needs. Growing up, I never fully understood the exact medical reasons behind his condition. I just knew he was a bit of a slow learner and had to deal with some minor ongoing health issues. He was a sweet kid, and the entire family looked out for him. When I finally became a teenager, I found out a massive secret that completely reframed our family tree. As it turns out, he is not a blood relation of mine at all. His mother married my uncle when they were fresh out of school. She was already pregnant at the time, so everyone in our social circle simply assumed the child belonged to my uncle. But that baby was not his. My aunt had been dealing with a horrific, nightmarish situation at home, facing constant, severe domestic assault within her own household for years. That environment eventually resulted in a forced pregnancy linked directly to that ongoing abuse. My uncle and her were dating back then, but they had never been intimate in that way. Once she realized her situation, she broke down and told him the absolute truth. Instead of walking away, my uncle made an incredibly brave choice. They decided to raise the baby together, focusing entirely on keeping the child as far away from her dangerous father as humanly possible. The only logistical way they could pull this off under the law was to get married immediately, because she was still under 18 years old at the time. My uncle stepped up and raised my cousin entirely as his own son, even though he knew the truth from day one. He gave that boy a proper, loving home. Due to the intense stress and the terrible circumstances surrounding his conception, my cousin ended up with some permanent behavioral and health issues. But he grew up surrounded by genuine care and was given absolutely everything they could provide. To this day, he still has no idea about the darkness of his past. He is doing fine now, just living his life at his own pace. Cultural note: in the United States during the late 20th century, minors seeking to escape abusive households face severe legal hurdles, as social services frequently prioritized returning runaways to their legal guardians. Getting married with parental consent, or through specific judicial bypasses, was one of the few absolute legal mechanisms available for individuals under 18 to instantly achieve legal adult status and protect a newborn from an abusive relative. I was pretty young when all of this went down, so the details might not be flawless, but I swear every single word of this story is true. I grew up in a beautiful, quiet coastal town. We had these next-door neighbors whom I absolutely adored. My parents were great friends with them, and their kids were roughly my exact age. It was a wonderful setup. We played outside together all the time. Then, out of nowhere, they suddenly packed up and moved away. I was incredibly confused because there had been zero warning signs that they were planning to leave. I distinctly remember seeing a couple of police cars parked outside their driveway one morning, and then a few weeks later, the moving vans showed up. That was it. They were gone. When I asked my mother what happened, she told me that the kid's grandmother had suddenly become very ill. She said they had to leave on an emergency basis to care for her and decided to stay there permanently. I was only about 5 years old back then, so the story seemed completely legit to me. Many years later, well into my adulthood and long after we had all moved away from that coastal area, my parents and I were sitting around reminiscing over our old neighborhood. During the conversation, I happened to mention those neighbors, wondering what they were up to after all these years. That is the exact moment my mom looked at me and decided to expose the truth. It turns out that on that final night, the parents had gone out on a date, leaving their kids home with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned late that night, they discovered an absolute tragedy. Someone had managed to break into the house. That individual committed an unforgivable and fatal act against the young babysitter right there in the home. My mom explained that the investigators believed the babysitter intentionally pretended to be the only person in the house, sacrificing herself to protect the kids who were sleeping in the back rooms. The moment the parents walked into that horror scene, they frantically ran to check on their children. Seeing they were safe and completely undisturbed, they quietly put them back to sleep. The police obviously rushed to the scene immediately. Once the kids were in a very deep sleep, the parents picked them up, placed heavy blankets completely over their heads, and begged the officers to remain dead silent. They carried the sleeping children out of the house in the dark, making sure they wouldn't see the flashing police lights or the chaos in the living room. To protect their minds, they fed the kids the exact same cover story my parents later fed to me. They told them that grandmother was sick and that they were moving in to take care of her. The grandmother dutifully played along with the entire ruse for several weeks in another town until the parents could secure a brand new home to live in. They kept those kids completely unaware of the horrific violence that had occurred just mere feet away from their beds. They simply did not want their children to live the rest of their lives in absolute terror, fearing that the shadow would return for them. To this day, I still do not know if those kids ever grew up and eventually figured out the real reason why they left their childhood home behind. Cultural note. In American investigative history, police departments in the late 20th century often collaborated directly with families to execute silent evacuations from active crime scenes involving children. Law enforcement protocols prioritize shielding minors from visual trauma to prevent severe acute stress disorder, allowing parents to relocate their children under total secrecy before forensic teams began their extensive processing of the property. It is not a super dark or heavily guarded secret, but it completely changed how I look at my family tree. Back when I was in elementary school, I had to complete a standard history project about my heritage. One of the mandatory questions on the assignment sheet was very straightforward. It asked, "When did your family immigrate to America, and what was the reason?" To get some accurate details for one of my great-grandfathers, I decided to interview my grandmother. She gave me a very vague answer, saying, "Life was simply too hard back in his home country, and it was becoming far too dangerous for him to stay there." For a very long time, I completely accepted that explanation. It made perfect sense to my young mind. I figured life must have been incredibly difficult for a random teenager living in Poland, especially with the chaos of World War I right around the corner. I am sure that was a huge part of it. In fact, years later, I wanted to see the official documents for myself. I looked up his original Ellis Island arrival records and managed to confirm the exact details. He actually immigrated to the United States in August of 1912. He made the long journey across the ocean aboard the famous ship called the Carpathia. But as it turns out, the real danger he was running away from was not just the rising political tension in Europe. Life gets significantly harder and more dangerous when you are a young teenager who gets secretly involved with a married woman. According to what I discovered much later, that hidden relationship eventually led to an absolute unmitigated tragedy. It resulted in a fatal confrontation when the angry husband finally came to face him. Looking back at the whole situation as an adult, I can totally see why my grandmother did not want me to write down that specific scandalous piece of our family history on a poster board for my elementary school project. Cultural note. The RMS Carpathia became globally famous in that exact same year of 1912, after rushing to rescue the survivors of the Titanic disaster in April, just 4 months before the great-grandfather in this story boarded the very same vessel in August to flee to New York. For many European immigrants entering through Ellis Island during this specific historical window, the vessel was a floating symbol of survival, serving in that precise year as the ultimate ticket of escape for individuals fleeing Europe. One night, during a casual family dinner, my dad suddenly dropped a massive amount of heavy history on me. Out of nowhere, he started sharing things about his mother and his little brother that completely flipped my reality. My grandmother was always someone who lived on the very outskirts of my life. Even though she lived relatively close to our neighborhood, I never really saw her that much growing up. Every once in a while, she would randomly drop off some toys on our front porch while we were away, and then she would just drive off before we got home from school. It was always a very distant, strange dynamic. As I got older, I eventually figured out the basics on my own. I learned that she struggled with severe gambling issues and deep substance abuse problems. She had also divorced my grandfather back when my dad was still attending high school, which completely fractured the family unit. Along with that, I always knew that my dad had a younger brother who had passed away after being struck by a vehicle when he was just a little kid. But I never knew the actual logistics of that tragedy. Then came that specific dinner night. I honestly cannot remember what exact topic triggered the conversation, but my dad suddenly looked up and said he knew for a fact that his own mother was the one responsible for his brother's passing. It happened right after the messy divorce between my grandparents. Apparently, the little brother missed his mom terribly and called her on the phone, begging her to come pick him up at around 3 o'clock in the morning. She got behind the wheel while deeply intoxicated and drove over to the property. But as she arrived, she completely lost situational awareness, leading to a fatal vehicular accident on the dark road just outside the house. Overwhelmed by the legal consequences of her state, she chose to evade accountability, leaving the area immediately and abandoning the scene entirely. I always had a subtle hunch that there was more to the official story, but I never once suspected that the truth was that terrifying. Cultural note: in the United States legal system during the late 20th century, hit-and-run accidents involving family members in rural areas were exceptionally difficult to prosecute due to the lack of local surveillance systems and forensic technology. If a driver fled the scene immediately, and there were no external witnesses on the road at 3 o'clock in the morning, local law enforcement frequently classified the incident as an unsolved vehicular accident, leaving the family to carry the heavy suspicion in total silence for decades. My mother grew up deep in the American South. For as long as I can remember, she always told me that her brother passed away in his early 20s due to a freak accident. According to her story, a stray bullet somehow came right through the living room window, ending his life instantly. Since they lived in a very isolated rural area, it made sense to me. I never had a single reason to question it. Decades later, after my grandfather passed away, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword. The moment my mom saw it in my house, she completely panicked. She looked absolutely terrified and started arguing that the weapon was far too dangerous to keep around. She insisted that we either sell it immediately or buy a heavy-duty safe to lock it up forever. I thought her extreme reaction was incredibly weird for a simple historical collectible. Later that evening, I decided to ask my dad about her panic attack, and his face instantly dropped. He got this deeply sad, distant look on his face before finally deciding to tell me the truth. It turns out my mom's brother did not die from a stray bullet. Back in the 80s, his life was taken in a violent confrontation involving a weapon very similar to that blade. He had unfortunately gotten mixed up with a dangerous local underground network. those individuals became convinced that he had crossed them and gone to the police about one of their major deals that got busted. To this day, we have no idea why they decided to use a blade instead of a firearm, but hearing the actual logistics of what happened was completely sickening. To make matters worse, my mother was the one who had to go in and identify the body back then. The trauma of that room never truly left her. I found out about this family's secret when I was 16 years old, but my mom refused to directly acknowledge it until many years later. When she finally opened up, she explained that her brother was just trying to make some quick extra cash. He thought he was being smart by simply introducing people who liked to party to those dealers. I am around his exact age right now, and looking back, I can see how a young guy could blindly believe he was just making an easy buck. He never once imagined that a stupid mistake like that would bring the darkness right to his door. Cultural note. During the late 20th century, rural areas of the American South experienced a massive influx of illicit trade, often managed by tight-knit, highly volatile regional networks. Because law enforcement was spread thin across vast jurisdictions, these groups frequently resorted to extreme, unconventional methods of retaliation against suspected informants to send a clear, symbolic warning to the rest of the local community without drawing the immediate ballistic tracking associated with firearms. Before I was ever born, my family was at the center of a chilling local case. My parents had 2 other children who lost their lives under my mother's care during a severe psychotic break. What completely blows my mind is that, despite the gravity of what happened, the system released her back into society. Just a couple of years later, she had me. To make things even weirder, they had another child just before I turned 2 years old. But the strange part is, I never laid eyes on her. Not even once. Neither of my parents ever fessed up to any of this. They acted like those 3 children simply never existed. I only found out about their actual existence after an aunt passed away and left me her personal effects. While going through her old mementos, I found the original birth announcements for these other kids. I always thought my aunt intentionally left them there for me to find. She wanted me to know the truth. When I confronted my parents about the announcements, they completely shut down. They flat out refused to discuss anything related to those kids. A few years later, I decided I needed real answers. I went back to my hometown and looked up the specific dates in the old newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me to the archives was absolutely floored by the headlines. But honestly, I wasn't. I had grown up in constant silent fear for my own life, dealing with her sudden explosive rages. Deep down, a part of me already knew she was capable of something terrible. I broke off contact with both of them as soon as I was old enough to get away. It wasn't just because of what I found in those papers, though that didn't help. I had a massive slew of my own personal traumas from growing up in that house. It was a huge systemic mistake to ever let those 2 try to raise another child. Cultural note. In the United States before the digital era, local newspapers maintained physical archives known as newspaper morgues. These microfilmed or clipped collections were often housed in public libraries or historical societies, serving as the only accessible public record for small-town criminal cases and historical tragedies that never made it into national television networks. I discovered this heavy piece of history only after my grandfather passed away. Growing up, absolutely every older guy in our neighborhood would constantly talk about how incredibly tough he was. To be honest, he was the most intimidating man I had ever met in my entire life. You would literally jump if the guy just happened to sneeze. I am not even exaggerating. But the weird thing was, I had never actually seen him get into a physical fight. Yet everyone, and I mean everyone, both women and men, would say he never lost a single match, and that he usually never had to throw more than one punch to knock someone completely unconscious. Simply put, he was a dangerous man. But as I was growing up, he would always preach to me and my cousins to never fight if you could humanly help it. He told us to just walk away. If someone was insulting you, you just walk away. It is only words. He would constantly drill it into our heads that you never fight unless you are absolutely forced to, and never under any circumstances do you throw the first punch. Ever. I was always kind of confused by this advice. Every older person in our town would tell me how nobody messed with Blackie because of how many people he laid out, yet he was constantly telling us to avoid conflict. It turns out that when he was in his 20s, he got into a heated dispute with a local guy. Apparently, the individual kept insulting him and simply would not leave him alone. Finally, my grandfather reached his breaking point and defended himself with a single decisive blow. The true tragedy unfolded during the fall. The man lost his footing and struck his head against a concrete structure. It resulted in an instant, fatal outcome right there on the pavement. A momentary lapse in judgment accidentally brought a catastrophic end to that man's life. I had never heard this story before, and I was deeply confused about how he managed to avoid being locked up for it. But it turns out, he didn't avoid it. He actually got sentenced to 15 to 20 years in prison. Then World War II broke out. When I was a kid, I would always ask my mom how my grandfather entered the war. Was he drafted, or did he volunteer? She would always smile and say, "Oh, it was just like the movie The Dirty Dozen." Since I had never seen that movie and had zero interest in it when I was young, I had absolutely no idea what that phrase actually meant. It turns out the United States Army went to the prison and made him a high-stakes deal. They told him he could go straight to the front lines in Japan. If he somehow managed to survive the conflict, they would completely wipe his criminal record clean. If he didn't make it, well, that was his problem. He took the deal and went to war. A lot of things about his strict advice made a whole lot more sense to me after that. Cultural note. During World War II, the United States military faced severe manpower shortages, leading to the creation of special programs that offered specific inmates serving time for violent crimes a chance at liberty. Under these wartime policies, eligible prisoners were allowed to commute their sentences by volunteering for high-risk combat roles, particularly in frontline infantry and demolition units where casualty rates were exceptionally high. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. My grandmother on my father's side made a choice that permanently fractured our family line. Decades ago, she walked out on her 4 young children and my grandfather to run away with another man. She spiraled into severe alcoholism, ending up living on the streets for 5 long years. To fund her habit, she resorted to the most high-risk and degrading survival practices on the streets just to secure money for booze. Her boyfriend even encouraged her to remain in that extreme marginal environment so he could secure resources for them both. Back home, my grandfather had to work demanding full-time shifts just to keep a roof over his children's heads. Because of his absence, my oldest aunt, who was only 16 at the time, was forced to step up and essentially raise my father and her 2 younger sisters. The only reason my grandmother ever resurfaced was because my grandfather passed away unexpectedly from a sudden heart attack at a very young age. Since they were still legally married on paper, she inherited absolutely everything he had worked for. She immediately moved her terrible boyfriend into my grandfather's house and began acting as if nothing unusual had ever happened. Growing up, I was fed a completely twisted narrative. My father would constantly praise his mother like a saint, while always talking down about his dad. For years, I genuinely believed my grandfather was an evil person. In reality, he was a lovely, deeply caring man. My father was a wild kid who was always getting into serious trouble, and while my grandfather tried his absolute best to implement discipline, my dad resented him for it. My grandmother, on the other hand, let him get away with whatever he wanted, so obviously he preferred her company. It makes me physically ill to think about how she openly ruined my grandfather's reputation to anyone who would listen, when the man did nothing but love her and protect his kids. He even swallowed his pride and tried to get her off the streets once before he passed, but she simply spit in his face and called him pathetic. It wasn't until I reached my early 20s that my oldest aunt finally sat me down and let me know what my grandmother had actually done. Looking back, my grandfather was the true anchor. I only remember her as that strange lady who made everyone uncomfortable and constantly smelled like a heavy ashtray. Cultural note: in United States marital law during the mid to late 20th century, the absence of a formal legal separation or divorce decree meant that the right of election and intestate succession laws automatically favored the surviving spouse, regardless of prolonged abandonment or marital misconduct. Without a valid will explicitly disinheriting an estranged partner, local probate courts were legally bound to award the entirety of a deceased person's estate to the legal spouse, frequently forcing extended family members to witness abusive or absent relatives claim family properties. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I distinctly recall landing, going to the theme park, and having an amazing first day or two. Everything felt perfect. Then out of nowhere, the mood changed. My parents constantly had to step out of our room to take a massive amount of phone calls. They looked and sounded incredibly stressed. Every time I asked what was wrong, they just smiled tightly. They kept telling me that absolutely nothing happened and everything was okay. I believed them, because why wouldn't I? Eventually, our time at the park ended and we flew back. But instead of going straight to our house, they had a surprise for me. We took an extra couple of days to visit a massive water park far away from home. For years, I fondly remember that specific birthday. Over time, I completely forgot about the weird vibe and the non-stop phone calls. It was just a beautiful childhood memory. About 10 years later, when I was finally old enough to handle it, my parents sat me down. They decided it was time to tell me what actually went down during that trip. On the exact day of my 7th birthday, my uncle, my dad's brother, had tried to finish it all. He was struggling with severe drug addiction, had no job, and was completely broke. He felt a deep resentment because my dad had built the exact life he always wanted. In a dark moment of despair, he used a rifle and did something terrible to himself right in his stomach. Miraculously, he ended up surviving the whole ordeal. He was rushed to the hospital and managed to pull through. My parents extended our trip and took me to that water park for a reason. They wanted to make sure we didn't come back home while he was checking out of the hospital and recovering nearby. By keeping me in the dark, my parents protected me. They let me keep my 7th birthday as my own special day, instead of turning it into the anniversary of the day my uncle tried to leave this world. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, they were right. If I had known back then, I probably would have thought I had something to do with this terrible choice. Cultural note: in American family psychology, the concept of protective buffering is a well-documented behavior where parents intentionally hide severe crises, such as a relative's self-harm or addiction issues, from young children. Studies show that children under the age of 10 lack the cognitive maturity to process adult trauma without developing irrational guilt. often believing their own actions or events like their birthday somehow triggered the family emergency. When I was about 15 or 16 years old, my parents got completely liquored up one summer night while hanging out with a bunch of their close friends. As the night went on and everyone lost their filter, they casually dropped a story that turned my stomach. They explained exactly how our family home was bought from a literal monster. A guy and his wife had lived in the exact house my parents ended up buying. I think they were there for maybe 10 years or perhaps a little less. My parents said nobody in the neighborhood really knew what finally triggered the man, but one night, he snapped and committed a fatal assault against his wife. To ensure the absolute cessation of life, the perpetrator utilized an article of clothing as a means of asphyxiation before dragging her out to the backyard and leaving her in a very poorly dug shallow grave. Right after doing that, a guy tried to end his own life by ingesting hazardous industrial compounds before walking down to a body of water very close to where I live now, intending to drown. However, his dark plan hit a massive logistical failure. He tried to submerge himself right when the tide was actively coming in. The water currents kept pushing him back, so he was not very successful. The local police found him washed up and half dead on the beach the very next morning. The authorities had been alerted because a next-door neighbor had become incredibly suspicious after looking over the fence and spotting the messy disturbance in the backyard dirt. Plus, he recalled hearing a ton of sketchy, violent noises the night before. I think the guy ended up getting a 15-year prison sentence for what he did, but to this day, I have absolutely no idea what his actual name is. I tried to press my parents for details that summer night, but I simply could not pry that specific part out of them. They shut down. All I know is that his name was the very last one listed on the official deed of the house, right before my parents bought the property when I was only 4 years old. Cultural note: in the United States real estate market, properties associated with severe crimes are legally classified as stigmatized properties. While disclosure laws vary significantly by state, many jurisdictions during the late 20th century did not require real estate agents or sellers to automatically disclose a violent crime to potential buyers if a certain number of years had passed, often leading families to discover their home's dark history through older neighbors or local public property deeds. When I turned 21, my grandfather sat me down and told me a heavy story about his older brother that I had never heard in my entire life. My great-uncle was a massive boozer for most of his time on this earth. He eventually passed away at 92, and by then, he had only switched from hard liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2, but that was only after surgeons had to remove half of his lung. He was a tough, stubborn old man. My grandfather and my uncle grew up on a rural family farm back in the decade of the 30s and the 40s. Mostly, the family ran the entire operation by themselves. However, from time to time, they would hire random drifters as temporary farmhands to help out with the heavy seasonal work. In 1950, my uncle and one of those hired farmhands were out drinking heavily at a local spot. They were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible with the top down. My uncle was the one behind the wheel. Being deeply intoxicated, he completely misjudged a sharp turn that had a very steep embankment on the right side of the road. He ran the convertible straight up the dirt bank, which was steep enough to flip the vehicle entirely upside down in a fraction of a second. My uncle was violently thrown completely clear from the car as it rolled, but the poor farmhand he was drinking with was unable to escape the vehicle's frame as it slammed down onto the ground. My grandfather told me the impact was so devastating that it caused an instant catastrophic fatality, leaving behind a horrific scene on that dark road. Because the farmhand was just a nameless drifter without any real family to make a fuss, and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle's lawyer pulled some major strings. My uncle was allowed to immediately enlist in the military to avoid facing any severe criminal charges or prison time for the wreck. He vanished into Korea and stayed there until the very end of the war. That afternoon was the absolute only time I have ever heard that story told within my family. Even though I am someone who would never have more than a single drink before getting behind the wheel of a car, that image definitely sticks in the back of my mind. It is a grim piece of history, and it is a story I will absolutely tell my own kids the exact day they get their driver's license. Cultural note. In the United States during the 1950s, small-town judicial systems often utilized a legal loophole known as judicial enlistment. Local judges and prosecutors facing high wartime drafts would routinely offer young, first-time offenders or individuals facing manslaughter charges the choice to join the military instead of serving a prison sentence, effectively shifting the burden of discipline to the armed forces while filling combat quotas. Growing up, I always looked up to my older sister. We were incredibly close, sharing everything you would expect a sisters to share. I never had a single reason to doubt our family dynamic. But as it turns out, she is not my full sister. She is actually my half-sister from my mother's previous marriage. When my sister was just a toddler, maybe 2 or 3 years old, her biological father turned out to be an absolute monster. He began to display a deeply dangerous and hostile behavior toward her in private. One day, my mother caught him committing an unforgivable act against my sister's safety. She was completely horrified and immediately tried to get help, but back then, nobody in the community believed her. The entire situation left my sister severely traumatized. To make matters worse, during the divorce proceedings, that man actually tried to get full legal custody of my sister. Realizing the legal system was failing them, my mother made a desperate choice. She gathered my sister and ran away. She completely cut off all contact with her own relatives, changing her life entirely just to keep my sister safe from him. She vanished into a new town to start over. A few years later, she met my dad. He was a good man who stepped up and unofficially adopted my sister, raising her as his own. Soon after, they had me. I grew up completely oblivious to the whole ordeal. My sister intentionally kept me in the dark because she was terrified I might not love her the same way if I found out we had different fathers. Deep down, I also think a huge part of her just wanted to forget her past and pretend my dad was her true biological father. The only reason I ever found out the truth is because of a massive slip-up when I was 20 years old. Somehow, my sister's biological grandmother tracked down our address and called our house. I happened to answer the phone that afternoon. Because our voices sounded so similar, the woman on the other end completely mistook me for my older sister. That was to say, the very absolute least one incredibly intense phone call and an afternoon that changed my entire reality forever. Cultural note. In the United States, parental kidnapping laws and the tracking of missing children changed drastically following the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act of 1980. Before this era, a parent fleeing across state lines to protect a child from an abusive spouse often had to completely sever ties with their extended family and live under the radar, as local law enforcement agencies lacked interconnected digital databases to verify abuse allegations across state jurisdictions. My grandmother had a hidden affair with a Catholic priest while she was still married. She ended up leaving her high school sweetheart, a man with whom she had already raised 5 children. Shortly after the split, she moved in with the priest. Her children were forced to live a lie, constantly referring to this man as their uncle whenever neighbors or friends asked about their living situation. Growing up, I always believed their arrangement was a product of true love. I even found and kept old letters they wrote to each other while he was deployed overseas with the military. Their words seemed so genuine. Besides, I was raised to believe that my biological grandfather was an absolute monster. The family narrative was that he simply walked out and abandoned his 5 children. They even told me that when one of my aunts passed away in a terrible drunk driving accident, he couldn't be bothered to show up for the funeral. I never met him once during my entire childhood. I was actively encouraged to hate his memory. Meanwhile, the priest essentially raised my dad and my aunts and uncles. The entire family revered him like a saint. He passed away before I was old enough to form clear memories of him, but I always viewed his legacy in a positive light. He seemed incredibly generous. He took my grandma and some of the kids to Hawaii, bought her a brand new Suburban, and put a beautiful house under his own name. He even paid for the kids' college tuitions. One afternoon, purely out of curiosity, I wondered if he had any living relatives who knew about this scandalous past. I typed his name into a search engine, and what appeared on my screen changed my life forever. His name was officially listed in a major civil litigation alongside a large group of other officials regarding severe institutional violations over an extended period of time. You can easily guess the nature of those allegations. Unease instantly set in. I began to dig much deeper into the public archives until I pulled up a specific 16-page document. This file was entirely about him. It contained old police reports and internal Catholic Church investigations detailing his severe transgressions. Early in his career, he had been accused of unlawfully sheltering a minor who had fled her home. Reading the old police report was absolutely devastating because it was clear the local officers did no real due diligence. Nothing ever came of it. The internal church documents were even worse. Parishioners wrote anonymous letters complaining that he kept young, inappropriately dressed girls hanging out in his rectory. He was frequently drinking heavily and neglecting his duties. At one point, he claimed he was away on urgent military business, but church investigators proved he was actually gambling, drinking, and philandering in another town. They constantly put him on probation or sent him to rehab, only to quietly transfer him to a new parish where the exact same behavior repeated. Then I reached the official summary that finally led to his forced retirement. According to the files, on the exact trip where he bought my grandmother that Suburban, a violent dispute broke out. He became physically hostile toward my grandmother and violently turned on my dad and his siblings, compromising their safety while they were defenseless. I cross-referenced the dates, the locations, and the fact that my uncle still drives that exact same vehicle. The pieces fit perfectly. I was completely alone in my room when I uncovered this. Later, I casually asked my dad if he had ever looked up the old family priest. He admitted he knew about the lawsuit, but I didn't have the heart to ask if he had read the full 16-page file. I am deeply disturbed by the reality of the situation. If my family knew about his pattern of abuse and still chose to protect his memory while lying to me, that is terrifying. A few years ago, my dad and my aunt finally reconnected with my biological grandfather. He traveled across the country to visit us, and I met him for the very first time when I was in my mid-20s. Learning the truth broke my heart for him. He didn't abandon his family. He was actually the one who had walked into the church decades ago, frantically pointing out that his wife was having an affair with the priest. My grandmother was the one who abandoned the marriage. And while a part of me still felt hurt that he missed his daughter's funeral back then, I can no longer imagine the sheer trauma of a man having to face the exact priest his wife ran off with. I'm so incredibly torn. My own family systematically pitted me against my true grandfather to shield a man who was a total fraud, lacking any basic human decency. It has completely shattered the image I held of my grandmother. My favorite wild family fact used to be a romantic story about a grandma who fell in love with a priest. Now, it is just a historical record of hidden trauma and lies. Cultural note. In the United States, prior to the establishment of standardized tracking databases in the late 20th century, the Catholic Church frequently utilized a practice known as unannounced transfers to manage problematic clergy. When a priest faced civil complaints or local police inquiries regarding financial fraud, substance abuse, or inappropriate conduct with minors, ecclesiastical authorities would quickly reassign the individual to a different diocese or military chaplaincy, effectively resetting their record and shielding them from local judicial scrutiny. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.